Mr. Garcia from California for his 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses here today and for your service. I want to start, Mr. Secretary. I know that this last Tuesday night, one of our colleagues also sits on this committee, really decided to waste our time with a very political stunt, which made some deeply unfair and untrue allegations against you, sir. And while I'm glad that 8 Republicans joined us in defeating that resolution, I'd like to take a moment to correct the record for the public and the American people. So, Mr. Secretary, yes or no, is our country currently being invaded?
Congressman, that is a term that I find to be offensive.
And I do as well, thank you. And is invasion, excuse me, this is my time, Ms. Green. Is invasion a responsible way to characterize people who come to the U.S. to seek asylum?
Congressman, I've been asked very often in many hearings now. I heard one congressman actually cite that I've participated in 27 hearings. I didn't realize the number was that large. I am not focused on language. I'm focused on the challenges that we face and making sure that we meet those challenges on behalf of the American people.
Thank you, sir. And is your agency working every day to stop fentanyl from coming into our country?
It most certainly is.
Thank you. And is it true that the overwhelming majority of fentanyl is in fact carried through ports of entry by American citizens into this country?
It is, Congressman.
Is it fair to say that an orderly border actually requires comprehensive immigration reform, which would require congressional action rather than just executive actions?
Congressman, immigration reform is vitally necessary to advancing the security of our border.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you. Those are simple questions, but I think that your record keeps being distorted unfairly, and so I want to make sure to give you a chance to clear that up. And I think it's also important to hear how we're talking about security and our threats to the homeland, how the current head of the Republican Party spent Veterans Day just recently. So I want to read you this first sentence. In honor of our great veterans on Veterans Day, we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, lie, steal, and cheat on elections, and will do anything possible, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and the American dream. Here we see Donald Trump calling his fellow Americans vermin and threatening to root out people based on their political beliefs. This is the kind of rhetoric that reminds me of the worst types of dictators in history, and it's not Trump's first time using this kind of rhetoric. He told an audience in Iowa that immigrants were poisoning the blood of our country. That's a quote. He has promised to violate federal laws in order to build mass deportation camps and promised to restore his Muslim ban. He even wants to cancel legal status for certain categories of immigrants. Donald Trump, of course, has had dinner and hosted open Holocaust deniers and white nationalists. And we all, of course, remember that he praised the white nationalist Charlottesville marchers who chanted, "Jews will not replace us." And of course, he faces federal felony charges for his role in the January 6th insurrection. Now, Mr. Secretary, Director Wray, I'm not going to ask you to respond directly to Donald Trump's statements, but I think we can all agree that they're not worthy of certainly anybody running for president. And as we move into this election year, I'm deeply concerned about Donald Trump, particularly as he faces more and more pressure from his supporters that may try to invoke as additional violence that we might see from fringe supporters of his. Now, Mr. Secretary, I wrote to you ahead of Donald Trump's first indictment expressing concerns about his ability to provoke violent attacks, and I'd like to thank you for your ongoing attention to this matter and more broadly for taking on the challenges we have around white supremacy, around the huge actions that are happening across this country that impact a lot of people. We also know that Donald Trump isn't the only politician that has used has a history of violent rhetoric in this country, and we need to call it out at every single turn. I want to just finally, Mr. Director Wray, I want to raise one final issue with you. The Anti-Defamation League found that in 2022, mass shootings in the U.S. accounted for most extremism-related fatalities last year, with about 80% of those murders committed by white supremacists. We saw that in the Dallas area mall case, in the Dollar General store in Jacksonville. There's been additional shootings after shootings. What would you need from Congress to help you better tackle this threat as it relates to mass shootings?
Well, our budget request that went up in the fiscal '24 budget request includes a number of resources for counterterrorism, including that would speak to this threat. That's important because, as you've heard in my testimony here today, the foreign terrorist threat is not only not abating, but it's intensifying. And so we certainly can't be put in a position where we're having to, rob Peter to pay Paul, if you will, to protect the American people from all forms of terrorist attack.
Thank you.
There
for
also,
your
I
service,
should say, on the issue of mass acts of violence, mass shootings, putting ideology aside or anything, or motivation, I think there are also parts of the appropriation request that go to our ability at NICS to do background checks in a timely way and process, obviously, make sure that guns are not purchased by people who are prohibited under existing law from having them.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Green, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Secretary Mayorkas, I want you to look at these innocent Americans. Do you see them?
I do, Congresswoman.
They are dead. They're from Dalton, Georgia, in my district. They're dead because a 17-year-old, likely affiliated with the cartels, was smuggling illegal aliens into our country in Texas, breaking our laws, and this happens every single day in our country. Earlier this week, 8 Republicans joined the Democrats and protected your job. But I want you to know, you have a short time coming. You can honorably resign, or we are going to impeach you, and it's happening very, very soon. Mr. Wray, do you remember on October 18th when the Capitol complex was illegally occupied, breaking same laws that you have hunted down Americans for from January 6th? Are you familiar with this?
I don't recognize the picture that you're holding.
Well, because maybe your agents haven't been doing a good job into investigating the organizers that broke the law, illegally occupied this very building that we're sitting in right now, and over 300 of them were arrested. Some of them attacked police officers. I haven't seen on the news where the FBI is hunting them down with helicopters, tanks in the streets, raiding their homes with flashbangs, targeting these people, watching these people, throwing them in jail for them to stay in pre-trial in solitary confinement for years before they ever face trial. You want to know what this says? I'll tell you. This is one of the organizers' phones, and this is a chat, and it says at the top, Global Intifada. Now, while we're talking about terrorism today, are you familiar with the term intifada?
I've certainly heard the term.
Do you know the definition?
I'm not going to try to define it, but
It means Arab uprising or jihad. Are you concerned about jihad in this country?
I am, and I have consistently testified to that effect.
Yes, but are you interested in using the FBI? You are the director of the FBI. Do you hunt down terrorists in our country? Those that would be responsible for jihad?
Absolutely, and that's why we've had jihadist-inspired terrorism at our highest national threat priority level since the day that I started as FBI director.
Do you still use the Southern Poverty Law Center as a source? You use them. The FBI used the Southern Poverty Law Center as a source when targeting Catholics. Are you still using the Southern Poverty Law Center as a source?
Congresswoman, what I think you're referring to is the so-called Richmond intelligence product, which as soon as I learned about it, I was horrified, withdrew it. We had an inspection done, and part of the problem that we found with that particular product by that particular office is precisely what you're talking about, the reliance on the Southern Poverty Law Center and the way in which they relied on.
Well, you relied on the Southern Poverty Law Center, but I would have you know, Mr. Wray, that this one right here, this person involved in the Global Intifada group that illegally, they broke the law, came in and occupied the Cannon Office House building, interrupted Congress, interrupted hearings. Right here, Katrina Bleakley is the lead attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Were you aware of this?
Congresswoman, as I said, I haven't seen the photos that you're holding up before.
Maybe, well, I posted them on my Twitter account. It's public. You know, maybe
I don't
you guys
spend a lot of time on Twitter.
Well, you know, I'm sure you do. because the Department of Homeland Security, organized with other offices, has censored many Americans, including myself.
I'm not part of the Department of Homeland Security.
Right, Mr. Wray, you should be interested in investigating terrorism, and this right here is proof that we had terrorists in our own office building, global intifada, and you rely on the Southern Poverty Law Centers. Katrina Bleakley is one of the organizers. I'll send this over to your office so maybe perhaps you can stop targeting innocent grandmothers and veterans who walked through the Capitol on January 6th and might actually go after people tied to Hamas, tied to Hezbollah, and likely Iran. Mr. Wray, are you interested in members of Congress that are organized and participating in a Facebook group that has ties to Hamas?
We're not investigating people for participating in a Facebook group.
A Facebook group that is tied to Hamas?
We have multiple investigations into individuals affiliated with Hamas, and they're active investigations.
You're going to tell me as FBI director you will not investigate Americans or United States members of Congress that are linked to known terrorists?
That's not what I said.
Are you going to investigate or not?
We are going to investigate individuals who are affiliated with Hamas if they meet our standards for predication, which are longstanding standards set by this department and the prior department and the department before that.
I would hope to God that intifada and jihad and terrorists in our very country would be something that you would prioritize instead of a 3-hour event that happened at the Capitol nearly 4 years ago, Mr. Wray. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Menendez. I think you're up next, sir.
Thank you,
Gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, earlier in your testimony, did you say that defunding the FBI would be, quote, a gift to the Chinese Communist Party, quote, more power to the cartels, and, quote, more damage to critical infrastructure?
I believe I said words to that effect, yes.
I appreciate that. Not everybody was in the room during that part of your testimony. I want to follow up on what my colleague, Mr. Higgins, said about, quote, armed oppression as one of the primary threats to the homeland. I agree that armed oppression is a massive threat to our homeland, but we need to be clear about what actually constitutes armed oppression. In this country, minority groups are routinely targets of weaponized oppression. Armed oppression is when black men cannot go safely for a run in Georgia. Armed oppression is when black youth cannot wear hoodies in Florida. Armed oppression is being LGBTQ in this country and not being able to safely go to a nightclub in Florida. Armed oppression is living in a Hispanic community and being targeted while going to Walmart in El Paso. Armed oppression is being black in this country and not being able to go grocery shopping in Buffalo without being targeted because of the color of your skin. Armed oppression is not being able to go safely to a church, synagogue, mosque, temple, or any place of worship to practice your faith. Domestic terrorists have targeted each of these locations and each of these groups in acts of armed oppression. Yet, when we in the House Committee on Homeland Security established our committee oversight plan for the 118th Congress, my Republican colleagues refused to include capital D, domestic terrorism in our plan. That, in my opinion, is where this committee is failing when we consider our threats to the homeland. New Jersey's 8th Congressional District is home to what Homeland Security experts call the most dangerous 2 miles in America, containing ports, airports, major rail lines, densely populated cities, and chemical plants. I'm proud of the work that President Biden and the New Jersey congressional delegation have done to improve the safety, reliability, and resiliency of critical infrastructure in North Jersey. The Biden administration has aggressively protected our critical infrastructure from foreign adversaries, with President Biden admonishing Russian President Vladimir Putin that certain critical infrastructure is off limits, a stark contrast to President Trump, who proposed a joint cyber unit with Russia. Secretary Mayorkas, when considering the threat landscape, how does the department take into account the risk posed by having multiple critical infrastructure sectors in close geographic proximity?
Congressman, the proximity of elements of our critical infrastructure only increase the challenge that we confront, but we work very, very closely with our critical infrastructure partners. The great majority of this country's critical infrastructure rests in the hands of the private sector. We work very closely with the private sector to ensure the security of our critical infrastructure. the remarkable men and women of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency do a tremendous job.
And on the issue of cybersecurity, I want to address the current threat landscape. When we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking about threats that don't just come up from nation states like Iran, but often from a network of proxies and affiliated groups. Secretary Mayorkas, how is the current conflict in Israel giving us additional insight about Iranian-backed cyber threat actors?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the?
Of course. How is the current conflict in Israel giving us additional insight about Iranian-backed cyber threat actors?
I think what we are seeing, Congressman, and I'll defer to my colleagues as well, as the use of cyber as a tool in the repertoire of our adversaries. And we're seeing that play out in the Middle East conflict, just as we have seen it in the context of the unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine.
I appreciate that. One more question for you. In your testimony, you mentioned how critical it is that the CFATS program is reauthorized. I'm particularly invested in the CFATS program because there are 4 facilities covered by the program in New Jersey's 8th Congressional District. How does the CFATS program help keep our critical infrastructure safe?
Congressman, the CFATS program, the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards, allow us to inspect facilities to ensure adherence with the security and safety precautions that are necessary to protect the surrounding communities. That is one aspect of CFATS. We must achieve the reauthorization of that program.
I agree. I just want to quickly address some of the ways that my colleagues have attacked Secretary Mayorkas here and in other hearings. Mr. Secretary, you and I have had our disagreements on policies, including recently on an ICE detention center in Elizabeth in my district, and I'm looking forward to your department's response to my letter on that. But I have 2 quick questions for you. During your long career in public service, including 30 years as a law enforcement official and senior positions in the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration, did you take your responsibility to the American public seriously?
I have, and I continue to do so,
When
Congressman.
President Biden asked you to serve as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, did you accept to help keep the American people safe?
I did, Congressman.
Is that what you focus on every single day when you wake up to take this office?
It indeed is.
Thank you so much for your service, sir. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito, the gentleman from the great state of New York.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, the crisis at the southwest border not only impacts border states such as Texas and Arizona, but now every state is truly a border state. State and local leaders from sanctuary cities such as New York and Chicago are starting to feel the strain effects of the border crisis. Over the last months, we've seen dozens of arrests at the Roosevelt Hotel, which is housing migrants, including crimes against children, assaults, traumatic beatings using no parking signs, and assaults against my fellow members of the NYPD. There was a migrant that came into New York City that in his first 45 days in New York was arrested 6 times on 14 different charges. But there was no charges because the great district attorney, one that my colleague from New York, Mr. Goldman, has supported, the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, declined prosecution. Governor Hochul has said there's no room left at the inn. There is, and I've spoken as recently as 25 minutes ago to commissioners of police on Long Island who said there is zero communication from Homeland Security about the individuals that are coming in to our communities. Less than 2 years into his tenure, Mayor Adams has faced challenges finding housing and feeding millions of migrants that have come from the border. Mayor Adams at one point during a public speech said, and I quote, "The influx of migrants along the southwest border will destroy New York City," end quote. Illinois Governor, another Democrat, recently sent a letter to President Biden calling the influx, quote, "untenable." New York City is facing a potential 15% cut across the board to city agencies over the next 9 months. Why? To deal with migrants because of your failed policies. So my question, and these are yes or no time to answer differently. Do you agree with Mayor Adams when he said that the influx of migrants along the southwest border will destroy New York City? Yes or no?
Congressman,
Yes or no, sir?
Congressman, I'm going to answer your question. that we do not underestimate the challenge of the southern
Mr.
border.
Secretary, with all due respect, it's a yes or no question.
I've answered that question, and let me also add.
Okay. Do you agree with the Illinois governor who sent the letter to President Biden calling the influx unattainable? Yes or no?
Congressman, we work very closely with the cities to address.
Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, it's a yes or no question. Yes or not?
I'm going to answer your
Okay.
question, Congressman.
Does it concern you that Mayor Adams' office asked a judge to stop a decades-old right to shelter mandate, which requires New York to give place to sleep